do better if I play a little music to bring you back. It's kind of like with kids, it works a little better. I'm going to grab this door. I will watch everything out here. It's just easier for me. That way those who are maybe hiding in there will work their way around. In case you're not aware, Valentine's Day is Saturday. I share that for all of the husbands out there. We have a little pre-warning, just so that you're ready. But it's a day that we celebrate relationships. It's a day that we celebrate love. It's a day that's also filled with a lot of expectations. And I would even say social pressure. Because let's be honest, any other day you could come home and not have flowers or not do something special and you'd be just fine. But maybe if you pull that on Valentine's Day, things won't go real well, right? And if friends find out that you didn't do that, there's a lot of social pressure that goes around this stuff. But let's be honest, beyond Valentine's Day, beyond this specific day that we set aside to honor people that we care about, we all want to feel loved. We all want to feel noticed. We all want to feel appreciated, right? We all want to feel valued. Those are very normal, typical things. And so I have been thinking back about some of my past Valentine's Day experiences. You guys ever do this? You guys ever reminisce and remember some of the stuff? I do this, probably not too often, but often enough. And I was remembering some of the good and not so good experiences I had, particularly with Valentine's Day growing up. I remember one particular year, it was a huge deal in our class. This would be elementary school. We had a party coming up. It was a huge deal as to who made the best Valentine's Day mailbox. Oh, yeah. Did anybody else ever do that? Yeah. Well, typically you would take a nice little shoebox and you would decorate it and do something really well with that. Well, my dad built a lot of stuff out of wood, and so I thought, let's build an actual mailbox out of wood. The only problem was I was in 4th grade and not allowed to use saws. Not a bad thing. No drills. I was left with a hammer and nails and whatever scraps of wood we had lying around. You can picture the mailbox that I built. Needless to say, it did not stand up on its own. And after I worked so hard to get this thing into school, I had to adapt it with a piece of string so that it would stand up. Otherwise it fell over. You have these grand visions of how this is all going to work. And it didn't work out quite the way I thought it would. Along with that came a list of all of our classmates. And why is that in there? So that everybody gets a Valentine, right? Nobody feels left out, and so it's really important that everybody is included because we all want to feel this accepted and just valued and really appreciated. Carry that forward a few years. All of a sudden I have really begun to notice girls. And on Valentine's Day, what better day to surprise someone who you really like with a nice gift? Anybody else ever do that? Am I the only person that's ever done this? Josiah, thank you. I appreciate that you are willing to be vulnerable and say, I tried this. Mine was a complete fail. I'm just going to put it out there. I really put my heart on the line. Complete fail. And so all of this stuff with Valentine's Day, I'm like, man, this is a rough time. There's a lot of pressure that goes around this. There's a lot of things that we feel expected to do and that really we build up because of the social expectations around it. Those have been painful lessons of things thinking you would go one way and they absolutely went the complete opposite. Whether it was a mailbox or a very nice, what I thought romantic gift to try and impress some young lady that didn't quite work out. Let's go a little bit bigger. We've all had friendships that just didn't quite work the way we thought they would, right? We've all had relationships. We've all had just different romantic relationships or different friendships, maybe co-working relationships, whatever it might be, some sort of social relationship that fits between a close friend and an acquaintance, that things just did not work out the way they thought they would. I don't know about you, but this is the time of year where all of those things that didn't work out quite that way, they come back. And I remember, I'm like, oh man, I really don't like the way that ended, or I really don't want to go through that again. Because those are things that are painful, things that hurt. Things where we take a risk and we really don't go quite as well as we thought it would. You know one of the best things that we've learned over the years? No one is immune to relationship difficulties. You know how freeing that is? Because when I was the child in elementary school that built this awesome mailbox, only it didn't look so awesome, and my friends kind of pointed out that it didn't win and I didn't win the prize, it hurt. And when I made that big romantic gesture and it didn't work out, it kind of hurt. And then over the years I've had friendships that didn't go the way I thought they would. That hurt. I've realized, because I started out here, that I thought I was the only one in the world that experienced that. I am not the only one that's had a relationship difficulty. In fact, what I've come to realize is that every person I know has had some sort of relationship that did not go well. Something that ended poorly. Isn't that freeing? You can have a big sigh of relief there. I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one that's been hurt. I'm not the only one that's had something that failed. I'm not the only one that tried and it didn't go well. No one is immune. So with that in mind, I was thinking of some biblical examples that showed relationships that really just fell apart. And you would think that being in the Bible that everything would be really positive, but what I love is that we have humanity life incorporated, and stuff falls apart in the Bible. Isn't that good? It is good. It is good because it reminds us that it's real people with real stories, real lives, and that not everything was perfect for them because none of us have a perfect life. So we're going to look this morning at Acts. If you have your Bibles, Acts chapter 15. And we're going to read about a very close friendship or a close working relationship that kind of has some difficulties. It has some problems. Acts chapter 15, verse 36. And if you've got the subtitles in your Bible, like I do in mine, it says, disagreement between Paul and Barnabas. It's kind of what we're talking about here. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the brothers in all the towns where we preached the word of the Lord, and see how they are doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left. Commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. It is such a short passage in there that you would almost miss it. But as soon as you read this, you should say, what is going on here? Because we had these guys, they're getting ready to start out for something, and all of a sudden when somebody else has mentioned, hey, we got to bring so-and-so along, no way, and they split. Well, here's a little bit of the backstory. If you were to read Acts chapter 13 and 14, you would read about Paul. And at this point, he has just really been converted from Judaism. He's still referred to as Saul. And Barnabas and some other companions. And what they are doing is they are traveling around the area that they lived in, and they're sharing the gospel with anyone who will listen. As they share the gospel, people are accepting this message and they're hearing it. They're getting together, and they're doing what the church has done since the very beginning. In fact, they helped to start this. They established a church around all of the believers. So they would go town to town to town and establish a church of believers. And so they have come back, they've gathered back together in Jerusalem, and they had just finished having a council here earlier in chapter 15. And Paul and Barnabas are sitting there saying, you know what? When we took that trip, there were a lot of people who accepted Christ. There were a lot of people who heard the gospel and responded well, and we established a lot of churches. We should make that trip again and see how everybody's doing. Doesn't that sound pretty good? Doesn't that sound like a lot of fun? Yeah, and in fact, scholars will tell us that the trip that they took was close to 2,000 miles. This is not a little 2-mile round trip. 2,000 miles, imagine that. Mostly going on foot or donkey, some sort of animal. That is a long time. This is not a weekend getaway. This is months, maybe a year. There's some substantial time spent together, working together for Christ. And something happens when they get ready to start out again. This is pretty significant, isn't it? This is two people that had spent a lot of time together. They had worked together. They had shared together. Imagine the number of meals that they had spent over the years, the conversations that they had had, how they had shared their lives. And I want you to hear all this, because this was not just something that happened momentarily. They kind of knew each other and went their other way. They were good friends. They were close companions working together. And as they're getting ready to go out on this journey again, Barnabas says, hey, let's bring my cousin Mark, also called John. Don't you love the surnames in here? They change everybody's name. At least Saul, Paul, that's pretty easy. That's nice and close. But John Mark, I mean, I don't know how you quite get there. But his name is John. They change it to Mark. Barnabas says, hey, let's bring my cousin along, John Mark. Like that one? That works really well. Let's bring my cousin along. And Paul says, I don't think so. Because the last time we started this, we were just into it, and he went home. He left us high and dry. We were working. We were going to do this all together. There were a bunch of us traveling and establishing the church, preaching the gospel. And John Mark says no. He says, I'm going home. And so this disagreement erupts. Now, do I think it was a nasty disagreement? No. But it was a very sharp divide. It was sharp enough to part two friends, two companions, so that when they split, we have Barnabas over here, and he says, you know what? I'm going to take my cousin Mark, and we're going to do this. Paul says, that's fine, because I'm sure not taking him. I'm taking Silas, and we're going here. Now, I have come across scholars that said, isn't this great? They were split up, and so they were able to conquer twice as much. I'm not so sure great is the word I would use here. Because here we have two followers of Christ. And rather than trying to work things out, one says, well, I'm going this way, and I'm taking my cousin, kind of like I'm taking my ball and going home. And the other one says, I'm going this way, and I'm not taking your cousin. I have my own toys, right? Or I have my own person that I'm going to take with me. This is a pretty sharp divide. Imagine explaining to the rest of the church, no, I didn't bring Barnabas this time. You know, a little disagreement. It's pretty rough. Here's the best part about this, though. If you were to look back in Galatians chapter 2, what we have right here of the splitting of Paul and Barnabas is the account that Luke wrote in Acts. But if you go back to Galatians, which is a letter that is attributed to Paul, we read, and here's another surname for you, but Cephas, also Peter, came to Antioch, and I opposed him as to his face, because he stood self-condemned. For certain people came from James, and he used to eat with the Gentiles. But after they came, he drew back and kept himself separate for fear of the circumcision faction. And the other Jews joined him in this hypocrisy, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Did you catch that? In Luke, we have that Paul and Barnabas split up over taking John Mark again on the second trip. But when we get Paul's account, Paul and Barnabas split up over doctrinal issues. Now, I find that semi-humorous, being in the church, because I have seen a number of people split over doctrinal issues. In fact, maybe it's the reason that there are so many different factions of the Christian church. There's a lot, right? Somehow we all proclaim the name of Christ, and yet we all stand very divided. Maybe that's a problem. Just put it out there. Thought. And so I love this. We get one account, and when we talk to the other one, we get a completely different side of the story. Reminds us of the second thing. Relationship problems are almost never simple. I've heard so many times, his side, her side, and the truth in the middle. And, you know, the truth isn't always necessarily, it can be swayed one side or the other, but usually there's at least three sides to a relationship problem, right? Right. Yeah, it's never simple. And if you're sitting here thinking, it is that simple, I'm always right, we should probably talk. Just a thought. Relationship problems are never simple. So none of us are immune. And they are never simple. Which means that if we're going to work through stuff, if we're going to deal with this, then somehow we have to find some sort of hope, some sort of solution, some sort of way to get past this. And it's point number 3. At times, and I want you to hear this, at times, relationships can be repaired. There are times that I don't think they can, and I am including in here, I'm actually including marriages as we talk about Valentine's Day. There are some times that marriages cannot be repaired. I love to see the marriage of restoration, where perhaps, I don't love to see anything wrong happen, but I love to see the couple work through that and restore and have a stronger marriage than they did.
Amen.
But sometimes that can't happen. And I will tell you that I've heard pastors say that has to happen at all costs. I can't, in good faith, tell anyone to go back into an abusive situation. I can't tell anyone to go back into a situation where there's fear for someone's life or harm is occurring. And so, at times, relationships can be repaired. Not every single time. And I share that because I've heard so many times that people say, if you just pray hard enough, God will fix this. It is just not always that simple. Okay? Along with that, since I mentioned divorce, we'll share it. I spent a lot of time prepping this week. In fact, I almost completed a book on marriage and divorce, not writing, but reading. You know, I'm not that good, but I was able to read most of it this week. And that's about snow plowing and children and all the chaos that happens. But one of the points that stood out to me is that although the Bible doesn't really affirm divorce, it accepts it as part of society. And that's why that we have the different laws that happen within there. And this is not a simple reason either. Understand it was a patriarchal society, so most of the laws were written to benefit men. If men are writing the laws, they're going to make sure that the laws benefit themselves, right? But there were some protections in there to try and help women in this process. But although it never affirms it, it accepts it as part of society. What that tells me is that conflict and relationship problems have been around since there were more than 2 people. Right? Where 2 or more are gathered, we always say, Christ is present, but where 2 or 3 are gathered, there's always the possibility for a fight. Disagreement could ensue. And so at times, relationships can be repaired. Sometimes we can work through the problems. And this is one thing that I love about this story of Paul and Barnabas. I wish we had Barnabas' actual side of this. But what we get is Paul's side a little while later. And remember that Paul was really upset with Barnabas, according to Galatians, over the theological problem. But he also seemed to have this disagreement about John Mark. And so later on, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we read Paul actually talking about Barnabas. And he talks about Barnabas in a way that shows that even though they have split, even though they went different ways, Paul still respects them. And what we read is 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? What he's talking about here are pastors who are basically bivocational. Those who were sharing the gospel and working to support themselves so that they could also share. And Paul was a tent maker all of his life. I do not know Barnabas' living occupation. But here he is lifting up saying, you know what? The 2 of us, through all of our ministry, have supported ourselves. It is a very neat way to see that Paul is still supporting Barnabas. Because I've got to tell you what often happens when relationships break. You know what we do? We run that other person to the ground. You ever seen that? You don't have to nod your head or acknowledge any guilt, but have you ever done that? Nobody moves. Nobody wants to cough, right? Remember, it's probably happened. It's never that simple. And we all like to be the one who is accepted and liked and loved. One of the ways that we have done that throughout time is to run someone else down. Not a healthy way, but it's something that happens. And so here we have Paul at least elevating Barnabas to an equal status of himself. And at least saying, you know what, we may have had some differences, we may have split, but we've got some similarities, we've got some common stuff there. What about John Paul and Mark? John Paul was a friend in high school. Paul and John Mark, how about that? Names are great. They are very important, but sometimes they can be very confusing. So Paul and John Mark. Well, what we read later in the New Testament is that in Colossians chapter 4, starting in verse 10, is a name that I'm glad it's not my name. Aristarchus. His name starts with an A. Colossians 4, verse 10, and he says, "My fellow prisoner greets you, as does Mark, the cousin of Barnabas." So here we have Paul right in prison, and who's with him? Mark. And this other prisoner's name I can't say. So if there was anything that was going on there between Paul and Mark, if there was any animosity because Mark went home, and we do read that in Acts 13:13, it's not just right here. It's not just in Acts chapter 16 that Mark goes home. We know that Mark went home and left them on this journey. And when we feel abandoned, can't there be a little tense feelings there? A little anger, a little resentment? Absolutely. And so years later, we find Paul in prison. And the one who abandoned him so many years ago is actually right beside him. That's pretty cool, isn't it? We also look in 2 Timothy chapter 4. We read that only Luke is with me. This is again from Paul. Only Luke is with me. Go get Mark and bring him back with you. It's kind of cool, isn't it? It's Paul again saying, I'm in prison again. Paul had a rough life. I'm in prison again. Would you please go get Mark and bring him with you? That's pretty cool. And so I look at this and I see a relationship that has been repaired. We don't really know that Paul and Barnabas ever really became great friends again, but at least they weren't running each other down, which I think is healthy and a good model for us to see. We can definitely see that Paul and Mark, whatever tension was there for the desertion that Mark did while Paul and everybody was ministering, that obviously that was forgiven and a relationship was not only repaired, it seems like it was strengthened. Because someone that he didn't want to take with him again is now the very person who's at his side. What a great message of reconciliation, and what a good message of hope for all of us. And I thought maybe there was one last part that we should look at. What does Jesus say about all this? What does Jesus actually say about this? Well, if we go back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5 and verses 43 to 45, we would hear a very familiar passage. It says, "You have heard it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." Basically, right? You shall love the people that love you. You can hate anyone who doesn't love you. "But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous." This idea that just because I get hurt, I can make you feel bad is not the message that Jesus actually taught. Just because I get hurt does not mean that I have the right to make you look bad to everyone else. Now this is hard, isn't it? I hope I'm not the only one that thinks this is hard. I think this is tough. Because when we're hurt, our natural reaction is to try and feel better. And one of the ways we do that is to make the other person feel worse or look worse so that we're accepted, loved, and welcomed into society. But Jesus says, it's not okay to just love the people who love you and hate the people who don't love you. You actually have to love the people who don't love you. What's cool is because whatever happened between Paul and Barnabas, it looks like maybe they let this play out. It looks like they didn't let what started out as a controversy and what was a sharp divide destroy their relationship with God, with each other, with common people, and destroy the church. What's so peculiar or so special about this is that this is a time that the church was really in its infancy. And some of the main people who were responsible for starting the church, for sharing the gospel, actually parted ways. And imagine the church only being a couple years old and some of the main members running each other down. I can't believe you'd follow him. You're not going to do anything if you stay at that church. If you follow Barnabas' teaching, you're going to be full of heresy. You're never going to get to see Jesus. Well, some of this doesn't sound too far from home, does it? I see some of you nodding heads. This has happened. It is not the model that we should be following. What Paul and Barnabas actually were able to reconcile and what Paul and Mark were able to do and what we see from Jesus is something completely different. That even when I am hurt, even when a relationship ends, even when I am frustrated with how things worked out, I still have a responsibility to love the other person. As hard as that is. And so the last question, the point that I try to ask in every single message is, where do we go from here? Well, I don't exactly know. There are some general things, because I can guarantee that all of us have relationships around us. If you have a friend, you have a relationship, right? If you're married, you have a relationship. Now, some of you may want to argue the quality of that, but that is something for you to work on. You have a relationship. If you have children, you have a relationship. If you have co-workers, you have a relationship. If you are sitting, I don't know, like in a room full of people, there's some sort of relationship here, right? Some sort of connection. Where do we go from here? Well, prayer is not a bad thing. I would like to think that one of the things that helped Paul and Barnabas and Mark to repair all of this stuff with this divide was their faith in God. Not their faith in just being right. And that is huge because most scholars would agree that Paul was pretty arrogant. Paul was well educated, he knew his stuff, he was a very good debater, and he came across as very arrogant and sometimes very self-righteous. So for Paul to actually lift Barnabas back up, it's a pretty big deal. For Paul to reconcile with Mark, it's a pretty big deal because when we're convinced that we're right, it's not always easy to extend that olive branch. So prayer is a huge part of this. Another part is really following the model that Christ gave us. What that means is we stop worrying about everything just being for me. And we live life in a selfless way. We look to see that other people matter just as much as I matter. In fact, we read from Jesus that no greater love has he that lays down his life for a friend. We see the love that Christ has for others and that also has for us. And I think the other part is that we do an honest inventory of the times that we've screwed up relationships. When I realize that I've messed up, and I can take ownership of that, I am a lot more likely to forgive someone else for messing up. Does that make sense? When I realize that I've messed up, I don't have a lot of room to stand on my high horse and say that no one else has done this. In fact, it helps me to forgive them and to maybe work at making those amends. And so where is the hope in this? The hope is that just because a relationship has a rupture, just because there is a divide, just because there is a problem, just because there is something that doesn't go as planned, does not necessarily mean it is beyond repair. There are those exceptions when it is. Make no mistake, there are those exceptions when it cannot be repaired. But there are many relationships that with a focus on Christ, with time in prayer, and with a sense of humility and forgiveness on each side, that a relationship can actually become better than perhaps it was before. What do you think? I hope that you find hope in your relationships because they don't have to just stay where they are. I think they can be much, much better, and they can actually move us to something that we never really dreamed possible. I will guarantee that Paul never dreamed that Mark the deserter would be the one who stood by his side in prison. What a powerful illustration of how a broken relationship can actually become stronger and whole. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time today. We thank you for this story that we read about. And God, it is pretty rough when we are hurt. When people that we trust, when people that we love, when people that we thought would always be there actually aren't. God, we pray that you would begin a restorative work in the relationships that can be repaired. God, we pray that if there's work that needs to be done on our part, that you would bring that to our attention. That you would help us to see that, in fact, we are not perfect, that we have been the cause of problems in the past, or at least strongly involved in that, God, that we need forgiveness as much as we need to extend forgiveness. And so, God, we pray that through all things, in every relationship, in every scenario, that we would seek to honor you first and not ourselves. God, help us this day to love you with all that we are and to love others as much as we love ourselves.